Well, hello there. So we're going to get into some curriculum theory, as you've been working on. Obviously, talking to my students here. If anybody else is watching this, good luck. Enjoy. Curriculum theory. Woohoo! All right, so Shiro talks about there being the four, which you've gone through. So just a quick overview here. Learning for the sake of deep content knowledge, scholar academic, learning for the sake of becoming a productive member of capitalist society, social efficiency, certainly one worthy of critique. Learner-centered, which is learning for the sake of individual growth and creativity. And then the last one he mentions is social reconstruction, which is learning for the sake of critically examining issues of power and privilege. Okay, so where are we going from here? So I've been working on this theory of thriving. I have other content on YouTube about this, so let me give a very quick summary right here. Basically, it comes down to three things. You have individual and collective well-being. So at the individual level, somebody's well-being is at high levels, and if you have a bunch of individuals in a community, then the collective well-being also increases. You might ask, well, what is well-being? And I'm sort of purposely leaving that open. I feel it's one of those terms that it's somewhat self-determinant, so we have to allow for that space. But I think in general, if you look through the literature, it has to do with things like overall deeper satisfaction with life. It's somewhat of a proxy for the word happiness. Happiness has its own limitations as a word. But in general, it's about feeling like you're able to live at a higher state of life, that you are, you're sort of free to have that experience. So, yeah, it's a word that's somewhat elusive, and I acknowledge that, but that's okay. So, we'll just leave it sort of open and somewhat ambiguous. The second one there is this integrative mindset between the larger community and the individual. So when we use words like sustainability and community, we're really talking about the larger external conditions. And obviously when talking about the individual, we're talking about the internal conditions. So it's this interrelated dynamic between the self, the social, and the ecological, all of which are interconnected to one another. And then the third is sort of a democratically literate, participants or contributors towards, making communities thrive more and more. Not hitting this sort of ideal state or this utopian state, but just, better, right? Keep improving. So you see the drawing or painting by Jessica Pearlstein, and I think she's really tried to explore that a bit. So not to go on too much, but you see all the different things that are either overtly present or certainly implied from all of the ecological changes, rooftop gardens and gardens in the street level, to the technologies that one would think would bring things a bit more in balance, although they're not perfect either, right? We have end of life issues with some solar panels and things like that, right? You can also see some representation there of diversity, right? The woman of color, for sure. And then you have what look like Buddhist prayer flags hanging between the buildings. So, there's hints of these things going on, for sure. So I think Jessica Pearlstein was, doing a really good job here of getting, trying to capture all of that in one particular piece. So, anyway, the sort of deeper aspect of this is really being liberated from a greed ideology that's running a community. So being liberated from that and constantly monitoring to make sure that it's not creeping back in. Okay. So we're shifting from a greed ideology to a thriving ideology, putting our intentions and thoughts and practices and thinking towards a common, um, general framework of what we think thriving is. So again, sort of re-explained here on this slide. Not a whole lot of new information here, but the one thing that I'm going to get to is that idea of the integrative mindset. So visually, this is kind of explaining it, right? You see highlighted in yellow the words integrative mindset. What we're talking about here is having a consciousness of viewing, the dynamics that I talked about before, that are the interconnections between individual and external. So individual well-being and the external well-being sort of encapsulated collectively by social and ecological sustainabilities. I know in the land of sustainability they have 3 pillars, including the economic. Economic is just a part of social, so I'm not going to select it out like sustainability literature oftentimes does, because I think it it's part of the part of the collective understanding of social, whatever social sustainability is. I think is one part of it. I don't think it deserves to be pulled out, especially when we're talking about a thrive ideology. Economics being highlighted individually like that, I think, presses even more so on a potential, reverting back to a greed ideology. So, it's not that you don't have economics going on here. It's just that they're, one would think, more in balance and just part of the social sustainability landscape. So as we go through each one of those, social, ecological, and then how they're related to one another, you can see the lists here on the side, and feel free to pause. But there's just not an exhaustive list, but just things that are issues, major categories that are issues with the on the social side for sure. Okay, and like I said, not exhaustive. There's more potential there, certainly to be added, but many of the kinds of topics that we already talk about. Ecologically, again, many of the kinds of topics that we talk about. I will highlight a couple here. One is that in the thriving category, or a thriving ideology, that humans would shift from being a invasive species to a non-invasive, responsible species. So you see that one 4 or 5 down. And then towards the bottom there would be a deep, I think, philosophical growth in terms of what we think human is and sort of our eco-ethics around what the human species is. And, so there would be a lot more in our collective mindset with that. I think that would be huge, right? And then integrative would be, how are these dynamics going from, between each other both ways. So what I did here was sort of taken from the first 2 lists and kind of combining them so we can see them together. Again, a lot more work needs to be done here. This is just kind of a quick pass at what that might look like, but a lot of just mashing them together and seeing them as how one affects the other. Lots and lots and lots of academic work to be done here for sure, as well as sort of regular civilian life, and certainly translating that into public education. A lot more work to be done here. Like I said, just sort of really beginning with this. Okay, so going back to the original 4 that Shiro brought up in the book. Shifting from that, so as I was reading the book, some years ago, going through his descriptions, and it seemed to me that something was missing, and couldn't put it to words just then. I've been doing a lot of work since then, especially around this notion of what could it mean to live in a community that's doing pretty well, thriving. Not perfect, not ideal. Again, we're not aiming for that kind of state. That's a losing battle, and I don't engage in those kind of conversations because they're just useless. But thriving, right? Sort of imbalance, higher levels of well-being. Um, the imbalance with nature, our social interactions are much more peaceful and certainly much more caring. So, with those things kind of at the forefront, um, what seemed to feel like it was left out. And in some respect, it was really just a combination of some of the ideologies. But when you look at it, again, sort of applying the thriving theory, the three parts of the thriving theory, um, it's a whole different set of dynamics that the other four don't really take up because of the way that they're separated from one another. And they're not. They're also, the other part of that is it's not just the fact that they're sort of separate from one another, but the other part is that they're not aimed at thriving, um, not in a individual slash collective slash external well-being kind of way. They're just not quite there. Where some might say, well, learner-centered seems to be going in that path, and I would say, yeah, I think it is, but I don't think it's to the extent that I have it described here. So let me get into what the blue box is saying, which is the first part of that is learning in the context of. So that part there is actually a big shift because the other four say learning for the sake of, right? I think there's a discussion to be had around the way in which learning is contextualized in each one of them. I certainly think that that's going on, but I think there's a real significant shift that says this is really very much about putting the context forward very explicitly. Right. We have a lot of demands on us right now because of our failures as a species, and all these different realms, and these failures are giving us, what, you know, if we respond to things because they're an emergency, we're probably going to do more damage at some point. We might slow some things down, but we're not really thinking it through, and that's where it's really important to get into philosophically thinking about where do we go from here. So, with this sort of thriving stuff in mind, so in that context, right, understanding that human species has been a failure in many ways. Yeah, we've certainly had some accomplishments, but we've also are failing miserably, taking care of the planet, duh, right? Taking care of each other, terrible at that. Or at least some societies are. Mine certainly is. Some other societies are better at it. But we have some grand failures that we need to deal with. So, one of the first ones was really, these three are just very much aligned with the thriving theory itself. So, learning in the context of maximizing individual and collective well-being. Okay, so that clearly goes right along the same lines as the thriving theory itself, just really an extension of that. Second one is learning in the context of critically examining interrelationships between social and ecological issues of power, privilege, and sustainability, so the external well-being, and seeing those from an interconnected, interrelated perspective. And then the third of democratically contributing towards creating community-based integrative thriving. And then in parentheses there, what do we mean by integrative thriving? The maximized levels of individual collective well-being and socio-ecological sustainability, again, which are all interconnected. I think it's worth noting here that there's two annual rankings of countries. Not that these are always the best ways to sort of gauge things, but I think it's worth noting at the very least. One is when you look at the countries who annually are at the top 20 of both lists, the first list being the WHO's happiness report, and the other list being the environmental, what's it called? It's EPI. It's a sustainability metric. And I'm blanking on it for a second. I'm sure it'll come to me. But when you look at those two lists, and that second one comes out of Yale every year, the countries that are in the top 20 are oftentimes very much the same countries for both, right? So there's a correlation there that leads me to believe that there's some sort of dynamic impact going back and forth. That when we are living in more sustainable settings, it also affects our happiness, and our happiness also affects how we contribute to creating more sustainable settings. Okay, so that's kind of the background from where this came from for me. Okay, sorry that I'm blanking on the environmental one. Anyway, but that's the general idea. Why is it that there's this strong correlation? I think there's something like they're not in the same order, 1 to 20, but within the 20, somewhere between 16 and 17 countries annually show up, the same countries show up every year as being the happiest places to live and the most sustainable places to live. Again, you know, there's certainly room for argument about what the metrics are, how they go about rating these things, and so forth. But at least from a point of entry, that's a really interesting correlation, right? And it should be of no surprise that the U.S. Is not always in the top 20. In fact, it can be significantly lower. You know, as much as we like to pride ourselves on being the best, we're really never really the best in much, are we? Anyway. All right, so looking at the learning itself. So this is, I talk about this in other spaces, but this is my map of a pedagogy, of a thriving pedagogy, okay? You have the issues of thriving that we're talking about, so I just kind of went through that. Now I'm going to keep working through this map in various stages. The divergent learning part is basically think of it in terms of like learning theories and how we go about doing the learning, okay? So we've moved from issues of thriving, obviously a lot more to talk about with that, but that's just the highlights, to divergent learning. So here's my take at really an adjusted, if not significantly modified, version of constructivism. This may be, I don't know, you have to talk to the people who are into this kind of stuff, but I do see this as being the kind of learning theory, whether it's significantly its own or not. Let me walk through this with you. So phase 1, you see on the bottom there, initial inquiry. So this is going to be very much integrative, meaning that things that we oftentimes think of separately or maybe don't even think of them at all, we're going to see how they really blend together. You see a lot of overlapping here, and that's on purpose, okay? So any place where there's overlap is because I'm seeing things as integrative. They're connected, right? So we oftentimes don't even talk about this really, but when we get into constructivism, we start with prior knowledge and experiences as the starting place. Okay, fine, but where does that come from, right? That comes from our kids, our students, our adults, whoever our students, from their personal experiences, but also from just broad communal knowledge. Conversations and readings and books and just things that they've done certainly on their own, internet, right? Looking things up. So there's a whole bank of understanding. The phrase community funds of knowledge certainly applies here. And that's a different dynamic than how I just described it. The community funds of knowledge is talking about how cultural groups, essentially, or people who live with each other, however that's described, neighborhoods, communities, or in general, however, you're putting the parameters on those communities, that they co-create knowledges together. And so there's, a lot that kids, I'm talking K to 12 here, right? But this is true for adult learners too. Adult learners especially, who bring a lot of knowledge with them to a quote unquote learning environment. Well, we're always in a learning environment. Life is a learning environment, right? But anyway, when we're going to teach about something specific, our students always bring in some set of prior knowledge and experiences. Now, here's where I'm going to start to deviate rather quickly from constructivism. Our task is not scaffolding. All right, our task is actually a little bit different than that. I'm not here to scaffold you to a right answer. What I'm here to do is help you see more and more and more into this thing that we call life, into our communities, into our experiences, into what you're reading about. And I'm here to help you go down a path of experience that is based on the way in which you're thinking about things, right? I'm not so concerned about you getting a right answer, because those are very easily found, right? We can go on the internet, we have texts, we have resources that we can go to. As long as you can find the answer, that's fine. If in terms of it being a skill, right? So I have established information there, but that certainly can be inclusive of things like skills, right? Information is the base for how you do a skill. So information is used quite broadly here, but I know a lot of times people don't interpret it quite that way, right? They read it as just like content I'm putting in my head, and I don't quite mean it that way. You have to have information to do anything physical, right? You have to kind of, be guided, hopefully, by some information of how to do something. Anyway, so scaffolding to me is really, really directed and super prescriptive to the point of I'm not here to make you believe something. I am, as a teacher, here to help you know and understand something. But the extent to which you memorize that is not my issue. It's not my concern. The extent to which you're able to deeply, understand it and apply it and test it out and shape and reshape it and apply it to these different contexts and so forth, that's what I'm really here for. And I'm going to learn a lot of things along the way too, as a teacher, right? So we have these sort of reference points for how to understand some things, but they're not the end points. Teaching today ends, for the most part, either at understanding the right information or having the right skill with maybe a mild application of it, right? It tends to be very contrived and at best hypothetical, right? It's hard to get away from that, right? So where do we go from here? Well, one is the next step is, how is this established information, whether you call it content or skills, right? How is this established information understood, perceived? How is it formed? Where did it come from? So you have lenses of analyses that you can use, right? There's many of them: critical race theory, various feminisms, sexuality, queer theories, eco-justice, and the list goes on. And they're all very worthy of applying to that information. And what are we doing? Well, we're trying to look at it from these different perspectives, being guided by these different lenses, so that we can see a little more into it, to see what's going on, right? And we don't give our kids, our children who are students, we don't give them a lot of these experiences. We just basically tell them what the right answer is, or expect them to have that on some level, and we kind of go from there. Now, I'm not saying all teachers do that. I'm just saying the general trends of teaching are very much guided by get the right answer and make sure you put it down on the test somewhere. There is shift, which is good, but we're talking about something really radically different here. Okay. Now you also see that there's that green oval, which is overlapping. The lenses of analyses are there because our lenses oftentimes come from our communities. And they certainly can come from academic communities, right? That's another community worth bringing in here. And by that I mean, scholarly communities that are doing that kind of work, like Black scholarly work or feminist work and so forth, right? So those are communities as well, not just the communities that we physically live in, but these are many communities that we can, find ourselves in. So this established information, it has connections to the communities again. So we started with communities and seeing this sort of phase one exploration of how we know things and what our experiences are, and having students do their own really full, exhaustive look at what they actually know. And then we get into this phase two where the teacher is doing a lot more guiding of, hey, check this out, look at this, we're going to teach about this concept today. The stuff that we're more or less used to seeing. We're not getting rid of it, we're just reframing it and repurposing it so that it falls within a greater spectrum of experiences that are more meaningful and purposeful, right? They have meaning to us, they resonate, they seem like they're important, and they're purposeful. They're something that we can use with purpose later on in life, right? Those are they're not synonymous words, just to be clear. Something that's meaningful to us doesn't necessarily have a purpose. Not all, it can, right? Hopefully it does. But those two words they do have different nuanced meanings. So I do definitely attend to those, okay? So this established information is not just a straight up textbook, Prentice Hall, McGraw-Hill kind of watered down crap that we feed to our kids all the time and just say, here's right information, spit it back. Oh, you got it, great. Oh, you didn't, oh well, moving on to the next thing. This is much more about, okay, now that we understand the concept, where does it have a home in our communities again? So this is a much deeper dive. This phase two is a much deeper dive than phase one. Phase one is just fully exploring it as much as we can with our own abilities to do so. Phase two is now with much more guidance from the teachers and whatever resources that we're being pointed to do that kind of work. Phase one is something that rarely ever happens in a meaningful way in public education, even though everybody seems to have a thing for constructivism. It's rarely ever something that we do well. We skip right over it for the most part, or do a very thin version of it. So there's a reason to do that as well. That deep phase one, where students are really doing that kind of work on their own, with sort of help. We're not teaching things to them, but they're coming out with it with their own work, because then they can go so far with it. And then we can see where and how, what kind of meaningful interactions we can have with the established information, the content, or the skills. What kind of purposes we can figure out are applicable here, and we can kind of go from there. So this phase two now has a lot more reason to even exist. It's not for its own sake anymore, right? It is actually connected to what we care about, what we think about, questions that we have. That's all phase one stuff. Phase two is the kind of teaching that we oftentimes just start off with, just getting to the right answer. And I was a middle school teacher, I did that too, right? So, phase three, though, is a real shift. It's something that almost never really happens. If you think about research in general, this is sort of like baby research that happens on a very regular basis now. So we're learning about established information, and we're taking time to dig into something more specific based on not just our interests, because that's not really enough, but our where we think we're going in life. What is it that we think that we're going to try to do in life? How does this content or set of skills, how does that apply and connect to where I think that I'm going in life? What the path is that I'm going down, which of course can shift, right? We can change our minds. We can resonate with something differently as we get older, all that kind of stuff, right? But there's this opportunity now to connect it to who I am. It could be, positive. It could also be negative, right? There can be some adversity to some of the things that we're learning about, because our path is very much headed down a different way, right? So with the content now at our, we have a sort of step 2, deeper level of understanding things generally. This would be sort of common for the students in the classroom. This phase 3 differentiates even further. It really differentiates, right? So you have this sort of phase 1 differentiated experience. Phase 2 is very convergent in a lot of ways. It diverges when you get the different lenses that you're applying to try to understand the information and the ways in which you're learning from community again about how it situates, that information is situated in the communities itself. But there's a lot of common convergence kind of stuff going on there, right? When we get to the path part, the personal path part, now we're really differentiating, very connected to meaning and purpose, right? And then connected to the content, connected to your path, and looking at those issues again. So in the very beginning, phase 1, maybe some of those issues of thriving came up. When I say issues of thriving, I mean things like social injustices and ecological challenges that we're facing now, economics, whatever. Those are that's what I mean by issues of thriving, right? That's a phrase, it's sort of a catch-all phrase for the things that are, for the most part, compromising our thriving. Now, it doesn't always have to be super negative. Maybe there are some things that we are seeing that's thriving, a thriving condition, a thriving set of practices and all that. So maybe we want to build on something that's thriving. That is absolutely fine too. All right, it doesn't always have to be about some sort of problem, right? So our path, our individual path, is something that we want to have at the surface of our thinking on a very regular basis. This is not something that we do in public education. We really don't spend very much meaningful time certainly in any formal way doing this. It comes up informally, but it's something that's sort of like hey, it gets a mention, and then we move on, right? So the content is connected to our path, connected now to this differentiated topic that, because of my path and the way I see my connection with the content, it gives me a certain, set of I'm really wondering about that now, right? So my friend who's in class is maybe wondering about something else. Sure, fine, right? So now this becomes our project, right? And then that project is another phase of deeply trying to know something in a much more nuanced way. It's not going to be the whole package anymore like phase 2. Now it's just going to be part of that, but in a more nuanced, probably niche kind of way, which is fine. It also could be somebody really wants to look at how things are interconnected and look at the bigger picture of it too. But anyway, it's really our path that's kind of dictating where we're going to go with this in a very, like I said, differentiated kind of way. And then we get to phase 4. After doing that work, all of that sort of path-oriented issues of thriving, differentiated work is there to sort of understand that issue more deeply and in a real way, and hopefully within our community. And then B, there needs to be this shift to it being contribution-oriented. And then obviously we're contributing to our community, trying to make whatever the issue is better, right? So yeah, that's where it's at, right? So why is this contribution thing so important, and why is it really the focus? Because everything is leading up to that contribution in the community experience in phase 4. Why is that the end point? Well, one, when you're, as I said before, I think when you're contribution oriented, the way in which you understand some content or skill is much deeper than just stopping at some level of, right or wrongness, right, that we oftentimes do in our schools. Do you have it right? Do you have it wrong? You do, you don't. Moving on to the next, unit of content or skills. This means that you have to know it deeply. You know it in a nuanced way. You know it in relational ways. There's temporal ways that we know it. There's all kinds of ways in which we're much more connected to it, and certainly we have our own relationship with it. That is way more than just knowing a set of right or wrong answers, right? So to provide that kind of contribution in a meaningful way, we have to have this, deeper understanding of what's going on with the content or skills. Okay, so very, very different. And it's interesting to me that we've gone all this time with education without shifting the end point, right? We may have shifted how we get to the end point, whether we're talking about behaviorism, cognitivism, or constructivism. We've shifted how you get to the end point, but we haven't shifted the end point itself. And that to me is, interesting and also disturbing. So here I am pushing it towards contribution, also knowing full well that when contribution is the end point, there's a lot deeper learning that's going on there. And we shouldn't be learning things just for the sake of learning things. I mean, sometimes we do, and that's fine, but that shouldn't really be the focus of school anyway. It should be oriented towards something like contribution. Okay. All right, so I'm bringing in here culturally responsive teaching because I think this also shifts with the thriving theory as well. I've seen various perspectives on culturally responsive teaching. It's something that there's no universal to this, right? It's you have different perspectives sort of guiding whatever it is. So here's the way in which that I'm looking at this. Through the lens of the thriving theory, I'm just going to go to the statement right underneath the picture there. Students are learning how to grow their levels of contribution towards thriving personally and collectively. So that's that changes the nature of culturally responsive teaching too. So just by pushing teaching or learning, just by pushing learning towards contributions in your communities, culturally responsive teaching, it just has to be there. There, you don't have to, remind yourself that this is the kind of teaching that you want to do. It's innately and inherently going to be part and parcel of if you're doing this well, it's going to be part and parcel of how you do this kind of work, right? I mean, if you're doing lenses of analyses, critical ones, if you're contributing to your community, if you're being aware of your own path, if you're learning, if you're being aware of what you know from the community, whether it's sort of phase 1 or phase 2 or 4, 3, whatever, right? I mean, that goes way beyond culturally responsive teaching as well. This is not just about black and brown kids of course they can learn. Why are we even having this conversation? Of course they can learn, right? The argument isn't, and never should be, I mean, unless you're a racist, it shouldn't be that black and brown kids and whoever else can't learn. Of course they can learn. They can learn just like anybody else. That's not the argument, right? And if anybody is still stuck in that kind of thinking, that listen up. What it is about is whenever you stress the hell out of people, their cognitive abilities are also stressed. And it's not because they're less able, it's just that they're less able to cognitively engage because they're already stressed, right? You go have something in life that's an acute or chronic stress, your cognitive just attending to things is going to be compromised, right? It's not your ability to learn that shifts. It's your the emotions that you have to go through are just sort of compromising your cognitive attentiveness. I mean, that's really all there is to it. And not, I'm not. There are environmental factors where you have eco-racism and eco-classism at play, where you have people who are living in much more toxic environments that are having neurological effects. I'm not. Yes, that is all happening too. And if that's happening, that's a different kind of stress, right? And it may very well biologically affect somebody's cognitive abilities, okay? But sort of aside from that, right, the general discussion that we have, aside from the neurological pollution that people are subjected to, that's a dumb argument, right? Any group of people can learn. It's just, are you stressing the crap out of them? or not. If you are, they're going to learn less. I mean, it's just that plain and that simple. This is why, uh, learning is much more tied to class as a correlation than it is really anything else, right? As finances and economic stressors change and diminish, you tend to have more learning. I mean, duh, right? Why are we so hung up on this? It's a very frustrating point, clearly. Okay. So, sort of back to this, right? So now, once you've considered what the learning theory itself could be, um, how do these certain ways of thinking become included? Well, the integrative mindset is certainly going to be part of really each one of those stages, but very much part of that phase 4 and phase 3, where you differentiate and then move towards contribution. Okay, so and it's going to be building through phase 1 and phase 2 as well, but it becomes even more important because the way in which we resonate with what we're learning about, or how we want to contribute, how we want to learn something more deeply, what are the specifics that we want to learn about now that we know sort of the background information, all that kind of stuff comes into play. And then looking at it through the lens of an integrative kind of thinking is huge, right? Okay, so an ideology of curriculum is going to have it's going to impact a lot of other parts of education for sure, right? Because it's curriculum is one of the bigger parts, and it kind of has ripple effects in everything. So one of the ways that I have rethought and reworked with the idea of life stages is through the depth psychology work of Bill Plotkin. And there's you may look at some other life stages, some other ways of framing our understanding of life stages. Totally fine. For me, this resonates because of the holistic aspects of it. I know for a lot of folks, they're in a different spot when they look at this kind of stuff. So just very quickly, this is about how we grow with our connections through nature, right? And that our identities are also tied to nature as well, okay? Longer discussion on that at some other point in time, but this is going to be a base for it. Now, when we get to I think the most important parts here are, especially through K through 12, is that stage 2, 3, and 4. So that middle childhood, explorer in the garden, there's an enchantment of nature and development of core cultural self. When we're teaching towards what I call the sort of alignment with the stages of development, when we're teaching with that alignment, I think we're doing a lot better for our kids, right? So when you read through these 3 stages especially, you see a difference, right? So the middle childhood is focused on core cultural self that's developing. The early adolescence is more of the social self that's beginning to develop. And then we get to the late adolescence, there's this withdrawal that we're all familiar with, but our society does a really bad job of supporting this life stage because there's this withdrawal and we want to go inward and figure out what our deeper purpose and path is or are. So if we're aiming towards contribution, if we're incorporating path and purpose along the way, that stage 4 is going to be a lot better served and a lot better supported. And we're going to have people, presumably we'd have people going into stages 5, 6, 7 who are much more well defined for themselves of where they want to go, what they want to do, how they want to contribute. And they're going to get there quicker and have richer, higher quality experiences with all of that. So that's the idea, okay? When we get into SEL, I've also on another video and lecture I've talked about where do we go from here. I really am not a fan of PBIS or ruler. They're limited to say the least. SEL itself is very driven by a lot of whiteness. Sorry. So I'm going through stages a bit differently here. So basically what it ends up being is that some of the things I said before about good and bad stress, or just stress in general, how it compromises our cognitive engagement, but really humanizing a child and humanizing emotions, how we do that before an extreme emotion, how we're there for them after extreme emotions, strategies for growth. These things are there in the SELs and the rulers and all that. But what they don't do is take into consideration the larger context in which people are being targeted, they're being exploited, privilege and power. None of that's talked about in the rulers of the world, in the SELs and the castles. And so, anyway, I have a whole video about that, right? So, that's what I'm talking about here. Being really mindful of those. Hey, look, I use the word mindful. All right, so let's get into the actual teaching now, right? So, overall learning experiences by paradigm. So, traditional, liberal, progressive, transformative, thriving, or integrative thriving. They're basically what's going on here is when we're looking at the overall learning experience itself, like I said, the endpoints don't move for the traditional and the liberal progressive. Now, traditional would include behaviorism and cognitivism to some extent. Cognitivism, you would get more of a social cognitivism and constructivism that would be in a liberal progressive version. But again, the endpoints don't really move, even though you have some differentiation going on around personal interests and things like that, which is, that's movement, it's good. But what I'm talking about here with the integrative thriving, you see the word transformative there, same kind of thing, is that this is much more oriented eventually towards that contribution to the community. And I've gone through each one of these stages already, okay? Now, when we talk about project-based learning, right, this is a really good approach for transformative thriving, integrative thriving. The others really do fall short, and their sort of big experiences tend to be around these sort of regional and national competitions, blah. Good, yay, competition, woohoo. And then we can all be proud of the winner and, right, hate each other for losing, whatever. Whereas with the thriving theory and paradigm contribution oriented, it moves towards a community event, and then you can go past that and have conferencing with other communities about these things. I've also taken a look here at the ways in which thriving engagement can deepen. So project-based learning is really just the start. It's not the deepest version at all. But project-based learning, problem-based learning, so it's some sort of authentic issue that we're going to try to figure out, doesn't mean that issue is a thriving-based issue, as I've described before. It could just be some problem, any problem. It could be a puzzle, right? So really moving this towards issues of thriving is going to have a different kind of impact on our thinking and context for thinking. Art-based learning, using artwork as a tool for learning. There's a few different ways to do that. So using art to understand meaning, and also using art to do analysis, critical analysis and things like that. Again, another discussion for another day. I have that in the thriving methods. I have more discussion around that in the thriving methods video. Some sort of, we're going from like potential to some. So generative learning means that students are at least a part of the process of selecting what gets learned about. So generative learning, right? And you see that in that, especially in phase 3. That's the big one. But you see it in phase 1 because it's going to impact how we do phase 2. So there's a generative thread all the way through, right? And then the contribution itself is generative, okay? And then the deeper versions are community-based, path-based, and contribution-based, all of which that I've mentioned at least in some level. I'll talk about community-based learning here. That learning from and contributing to the community is what we're talking about here. But path-based learning, being connected to our deeper purposes and higher selves and our paths. Contribution, something that we put forward into the community based on some authentic, legitimate issue. All right, so this is involved, right? So when we look at the different content areas, what are the ways in which they can connect with thriving and thriving pedagogy? So I've grouped things into these 5 different categories. I put philosophy actually just by itself. The rest you can see there on the right are a collection of different subject areas. The yellow is very, very briefly saying what the uh, ways in which you can aim towards thriving, right? So you see how philosophy can do that. You see how the STEMs can do that, and arts and so forth. Okay, it's probably self-evident kind of stuff. Now, what I'm doing here is taking philosophy as a content area, right? I'm going to go through the greens and do work with the pedagogies, and then do work with assessments, and also talk about the ways in which units could be organized based on this. Right. So what I'm doing is showing how the ideology, the integrative thriving ideology, has all of these ripple effects through the pedagogies and sort of the assessment outcomes and all that. So I'll go through this somewhat quickly, so bear with me here. But starting with philosophy. So you have in green just the thriving theory itself. That's not going to change. That's going to be the sort of starting place of how we talk about the content areas, right? The yellow is the pedagogy and how that's shaped for philosophy itself, that content area. So the yellow, you can see it's a 1-to-1 here, right? That top row, or well, if you want to go to the top bullets in each one of the columns, they're all related to one another. Right? The middle ones are related to one another, and the bottom ones are related to one another. Okay, at least they're supposed to be. So top row, we'll just go across here. Okay, individual well-being and collective well-being at high levels. That's the theory of thriving. Then using that, applying that to the thriving pedagogy for philosophy. So philosophy of self, community, and interactions with individual and collective well-being. Okay, so that well-being is now the thread that's going across what would be a row, right, for the first 3 bullets. And then when we get to philosophy outcomes, you have philosophically examined public health and technology-related efforts for individual and collective well-being, right? So now there could be other areas besides public health and technology-related efforts, but those are pretty broad in and of themselves. When we go to the sustainability bullets, right, we go from theory of thriving to the philosophy, the pedagogy with philosophy. So philosophy of integrative individual and community sustainability that attends to self, social, and ecological interconnections. And then when we go over to the blue, the sort of outcomes, and these would be sort of big, broad outcomes of a K through 20 experience where you're learning philosophy all throughout those years. And by that I mean philosophical thinking, not so much, it doesn't have to be the philosophers, although I'm sure you'd pick some up along the way for sure. But it would really not, so it's not really a history of philosophy and history of philosophical thinking. It's really deepening our understanding of philosophical thinking that would be at the forefront of this content area and set of skills. And it would keep deepening as you go, you sort of spiral and go deeper. Anyway, so this outcome here would be very philosophy and sustainability oriented, deeply examine an integrative mindset that helps us to see how individual practices and social systems in relation to their impact on ecological and social sustainability. Right, I'm sure at this point you're starting to blur out. I would too, okay? But the idea is that, again, this is an outcome. We would be able to, our students would be able to deeply examine ... right? And then the last one is really focused on that democratic contribution or participation. And so we would look at a philosophy of thriving. We would look at the foundation of that. That's what we would be doing all throughout those years. And the outcomes would be based on sharing that examination, right, over the years. Okay? So you can see how this plays out sort of there at the pedagogy and outcomes level. And then when we take each one of the pedagogies from that middle column, right? So we'll take each one of the yellows there and put them across the top, and then deepen what we mean by that, right? Be more specific about what we mean by each one of those. So you see that here, okay? So that's the setup for each one of the content areas. It's probably not going to make a huge benefit for me reading through them all to you, right? So take the time to read through them. Just go to the slideshow, okay? And I'll skip to the assessment so you can see all the content areas there. Oh yeah, sorry. But before I get to the assessment, the way in which a unit can be planned through these phases, the same phases that I talked about with the learning theory itself, okay? So if we did a unit on cell organelles, so I was a middle school science teacher and I did cell organelles. What would phase one look like? Well, phase one would be this student-led inquiry into public health issues and challenges. And by that I mean they'd really be thinking about the topics as they know them already and doing some just initial poking around maybe on the internet or talking to people in the community and having discussions around what are our public health issues and challenges that are in our community. Community can be broadened. There's many different kinds of communities. It could be global public health too. I mean, it doesn't have to just be local, right? So anyway, those various kinds of communities will pop out, and you can certainly ask your students to think about different kinds of communities that they're connected to, right? And then also a part of that would be an initial description of thriving patterns of public health, right? Of how that's happening locally. So it wouldn't just be the problems and issues. It would also be what do we think is the general pattern of thriving. So if it was a 20-day unit, ballparking this, of course, days 1 and 2 could do more of looking into the challenges. Day 3 could look more into what do we envision to be sort of a top, best version, best case scenario kind of a thing, right? It's an envisioning kind of thing. So, at that point, 3 days of that, hopefully it's been somewhat exhaustive. Hopefully you've given them a lot of support so they can keep looking for things and keep telling you what they know, right? And then you have that experience, whether it's on day 3 or 4, where you're really going through that with them. And then you start to really get into phase 2 of taking what they've already brought up, what they know, just various things that have organically come up in this area, and you start to dive into the structure of the cell, cellular processes, cellular organelles. How does public health relate to that? Where do these issues stem from? How is cellular health connected to public health, and so forth, right? And you certainly could if you were teaching cell organelles. You could start phase 1 by just asking them what do they know about cellular structure and cellular processes. You could do that, but I'm not so sure that would be really fruitful. It might be the larger issue that has a better place to have these conversations, right? So as we learn about the cell, the cells of our body, cells in the environment, right? We could talk about environmental cellular health. It doesn't have to just be human cellular health. We would get into those kinds of issues as we're learning about the cell and cellular processes. Additionally, we can dive into social justice issues that are connected to things like cellular research, right? Who's been marginalized? Rosalind Franklin comes to mind, right? With her sort of being pushed aside for the research on the DNA structure and all. So, and a whole host of other folks and other, Tuskegee, right? The ethics around that and how ethics and research have formed out of terrible, very white-led scientist kind of people who did some real bad things. So you see that as a 9-day, day 4 all the way through day 12, that's 9 days right there. And then phase 3, diving deep into a topic of their interest, looking at the issues more specifically, connecting with the community, and then moving it towards some sort of contribution, phase 4, for the public health. So that phase 3 is twofold, right? It's looking more deeply at these topics of interest, and it's also shifting towards what contributions can be, because you're also looking at these things as tied to community. So I want that to be clear with the phase 3. It's not, phase 4 doesn't start when we shift to contribution mode. Phase 3 is still forming whatever that contribution might be, prepping for the actual community experience. The actual community experience is really phase 4, or the final prepping of it, and then having that community experience, whatever that may be. And there's so many different options of what that can be. Okay, now the only other layering here that I think is important is to constantly go through, are we working in a critical based learning right now? Are we working in a path based learning right now? Are we contribution based or community based? A lot of those things are going to happen at the same time, but keeping it, as a teacher, keeping an eye on that would be super helpful. And going back to the ideology would sort of dictate, if we're aiming towards contribution and thriving, right, more thriving, then as a teacher, you need to keep an eye on these 4 things as you move through the unit with your students. Okay. And so you very intentionally, we're going to do this, which you know is critical based, or we're going to do this, which is path based today, right? It's very intentionally moving from one to the other, or incorporating 2 at a time, right? But at least you're very intentionally doing that kind of work. All right, so last but not least is the assessment portion of this, and it goes back to the content areas. I'll describe that in a second, but what we're really talking about here is, if the goal is about creating a more thriving community, right? It's this collective project that we're all engaging in, with these purposeful contributions as the end point for learning. Then we have to build assessments, and our assessments themselves should be contribution oriented, not just content or skills oriented. Although we want to do some assessing around that. I'm not saying we just give up on that. But it would be a lot more individualized and really tracking somebody's progress, as opposed to just simply testing them for, the right or wrong answers. I think there would be a lot less of that. Maybe there still would be some of it, but. So if you took that, remember I had the sort of green, the yellow, and then the blue columns, before, with all the different content areas. This is the blue column, and then I took each one of those 3 bullets from the outcomes and put them across here, and you can look, there's a lot of text, so I'm not going to read it, just go through the slideshows, and you can see, where your content area is. You can see it there, okay? And again, not exhaustive, right? It is just meant to sort of kickstart our thinking and give us some places to start with, right? And I'm going to end here, which is, the center there, you see a picture of all my kids. I have 6 kids, 2 step kids there, and then 3 from previous marriage. And the reason why I put this here is because you see, first of all, you see at the very top, the same statement that I started off with the assessment section, right? Moving towards purposeful contributions, and then the assessments themselves being built around that. So if that's what we're doing, right? These are my kids, right? These are my elementary age kids who I care a whole lot about. And as I think about their paths, I can see how the different content areas sort of play out differently for each one of them, okay? If you look at William, for instance, William is kind of all over the place, right? There's 4 out of 5 that you see his name. And then if you look at Kai or Dylan, there's only really 1 or 2 for them. And then, sort of a smattering for the rest. The point here is that as the different content areas, content groups change, and the sort of overall purposes of what their contributions will be oriented around, which is the blue text in each one of the boxes, I wanted to test that. So what I did was I just thought about my own kids and said, where do my kids fall with each one of these categories, right? And, now that, again, may change very much later in life. They may, take a different turn and go down a different path, whatever. This is just where I think they are at the moment. And the point, again, being that it's a path-based education system now. Now it's not just you need to get all this stuff right and we all need to think about it the same way. Now it's much more deeply tied to our paths and then the contributions that come out of those paths, right? So, one of the kids might, and let's say Amaya, right, who is not interested in the STEMs, but she is more interested in some of the other areas. Amaya, you don't see her name listed there for the STEMs. I mean, obviously, she could very well become a STEM-oriented person as she grows up, right? That's the possibility is always there. But for now, how would she bring sort of a philosophical and artistic, she's very interested in social studies, so the sort of sociological or a language based, right? She has a lot that she can choose from here that resonates with her. How would she bring that to a STEM experience? Right? It may not be something that she ends up with later on in life. Maybe she does. Right? I'm certainly not gonna hold her back. But for now, if I was her science teacher, how would I get her to do that sort of phase 3 and phase 4 work? Well, she's going to resonate much more deeply by going to the other content areas and making the connections with whatever it is that I'm teaching that might be science oriented. So you can see here that as a teacher, I think we do a lot more mediating with teaching at this point, right? We don't just know the content and teach it in a way that hopefully it's cognitively accessible so that kids can get the right answers. That's what we're doing right now. Hopefully it's more that we're actually much more path oriented and contribution oriented, and we're able to really differentiate and make connections and help kids make those kind of connections based on whatever their paths are. Okay, so that's really what this ends up being, right? I would love for my kids to all grow up and be great contributors to their communities, and little by little make their communities more and more thriving, right? And be very socially justice minded and eco justice minded, and seeing the integrative aspects between all of them, and so forth, right? That's what I would like to see happen. It's not happening in their schools right now. It's not. I mean, and that's not downing their teachers. Their teachers are lovely people, but we're not there. And that is disturbing to me at a time when we have so much need for that kind of learning experience and growing into to be those kind of people, right? So, yes, the ideology itself, right? We're good. This is where it stops for now. Okay. Goodness. All right. Take care. Bye.